As I said, my name is Jonathan Herron. I'm a researcher based in Fermoy over in Cork. And yeah, just today I'm going to be talking to you about greenhouse gas emissions from the Irish sheep sector. And we know this has been getting a particular focus in the last couple of, never mind months, but years, particularly in the agriculture sector in Ireland, and I'll touch on the reasons why in the next couple of slides. But it's just clear that the government has set out climate action targets, and they have allocated a specific target to the agriculture sector, 25% reduction based in 2018. And it's not so much as a target, it's in law now that they have to be achieved. So it is imperative that as collectively as a sector that we strive to achieve that target that's set to us, while also being conscious of trying to improve the profitability of the systems and improving the viability of our systems. So I'd just like to thank the other co-authors, Phil Creighton, Fiona McGovern, and Norrie McHugh, who are here today. So yeah, just what I talk about today, so just an overview of the Irish sheep sector. You would have seen some of these numbers before, but just to refresh your mind. Talk about the emissions that come from the sheep sector, what is available to us to reduce them, and then we'll just go through a quick case study on, if you do implement them, what impact will it have. So just a bit of an overview, as I said. So we know that is focused on the spring lamb production. Why do we do that? Is we're trying to maximise the use of grass in the diet. It's the cheapest form of feed that we can provide to animals, and it's a good use of natural resources. Large proportion of the land that's used for sheep production is on land that isn't suitable for any other agricultural purposes. It's not suitable for tillage or dairy or whatnot. It's fragmented farms and whatnot. So it does have a role in that regard. As of 2020, there was 2.75 breeding ewes within the country, and within the same year, there was approximately 35,500 farms across the country that had some form of sheep on them. That is pretty much a 50-50 split between farms that are mixed, whether they have crops, whether they have some form of beef or maybe some dairy, and then around the other half, which is just purely sheep. So they're specialised sheep farmers, is the term that's put on them. You do that out, basically what we're saying here is, and when you compare it to what Dave was saying earlier on, we're quite a good bit smaller than the average in New Zealand, where our average farm is approximately 83 ewes based on the CSO. Similar to our beef and dairy, we are a net exporter of sheep meat. So we're self-sufficient, 335% more self-sufficient in sheep meat, which means we're a net exporter of it. And it does contribute largely to the value of the agriculture products in which we export. I suppose it has increased in the last number of years. In the late 2010s, was around 300 million. It's gone up now. So the last Board B report in 2021 that I found was at 420 million. So it's gone up in the last number of years. That's as a sector, as a whole. Main market is the EU. Primarily France is our main market, followed by Britain, and then you have the others within the EU in terms of like Germany, Belgium, and whatnot. So that's just a general picture. And Phil would have said this at the beginning that sheep systems they're a very, very important component of our agricultural sector within Ireland and our local and rural economies. As I said, in areas that cannot usually be utilised for other, so you're using those natural resources. But as I said at the very beginning of this talk, there is this conversation, and these targets have to be set for the agricultural sector that we do need to strive towards. We're also trying to maintain the viability, so there are things that we need to be conscious of. Okay. When we look at our national greenhouse gas emissions, unfortunately, because sheep are ruminants, they result in a lot of methane. Okay, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. It's 28 times more potent than CO2. When we look at the breakdown, I suppose the full graph actually isn't in this picture, but I'll go through it regardless. When you look at the national greenhouse gas emissions, 37% comes from the agriculture sector. And this is actually quite different from if you look over the other European countries. If you go over to the continents, this value is 10 to 12%. The reason for that is because they have other heavy industries. We're an agricultural-based country. We don't have mining. We don't have a large construction industry as compared to other countries. We're also relatively, our population density is relatively lower compared to the European counterparts. And then, as I said at the beginning, our agriculture sector is dominated by grasslands and then the ruminants, so the cattle and sheep that graze them. And there are emissions associated with those animals. When we just focus on When we just focus on sheep, our agricultural sector is dominated by cattle. You know, it's nearly 1.6 dairy cattle within the country. When you come to sheep, you're at 1.2. You know, it's substantially lower when you actually bring it down to total greenhouse gas emissions. This is the trend in emissions throughout the years, starting in 1990, the first year in which emissions were reported, right up until, well, once again, it's not fully shown, but right up until 2020, which was the last reporting year. And it follows the population trends. You know, our national flock population peaked in the middle or early 1990s, and then there was a gradual drop off to 2010 when population was at its lowest, and there has been a gradual increase in the population from that point forward. I already mentioned that 25% target that's been set to us by the government. We have to reduce our emissions 25% based on the value of 2018. So 2018 is our starting point from now on. So that's what everything is referred back to, and that is the whole agricultural sector. So that's what we need to focus on. If you look at the breakdown of emissions, then you can see it's dominated by one source, which is enteric fermentation, which is methane. So that's just for the animal, just to digest the feed, to convert that grass into a utilisable form of energy, to give you milk, to give you meat, to give you wool. Methane, a small proportion of that energy is going to be lost as methane. There are other sources, manure management. It's relatively small if you compare it to the likes of dairy and beef, because sheep aren't as housed as much as the cattle. And then grazing, so when animals are out grazing, there are small emissions, and sheep are actually, they emit less greenhouse gas emissions at grass than cattle. So this is our starting point. We're at 2018. That's our new starting point that everything is in reference to, and we need to reduce that by 25% to meet the Climate Action Plan target. How do we do that then? So what is available to us, or what is the impact of different practices on our greenhouse gas emissions? Well, Teagasc have developed this thing called the marginal abatement cost curve, and you can, if you want, you can go online, you can find this, but we are updating it at the moment, and there will be a new one released in the next couple of months. And essentially what it is that we get a list of mitigation strategies, so practices you can put in place to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We quantify how much reduction that may achieve, but we also quantify what's the cost of putting that in place. So is it economically viable for you to put that in place? So on the bottom left, if you go through the graph here on the right, you have the measures down the bottom left hand corner. These are cost beneficial measures. So by putting them in place, you're reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, but you are improving the profitability of your system. So that's what we want to achieve. In the middle then, you have the cost neutral. So they're going to reduce your emissions, but they're not going to benefit you economically, but they're not going to hamper you either. It's pretty much status quo. And then everything on the right-hand side here, they're the measures that, yes, they reduce emissions, but unfortunately, they're going to cost you to put them in place. Realistically, what we're trying to look at and what we try to focus on and try to communicate are the practices on the bottom left-hand corner, the practices that we know improves efficiency of the system and improves the profitability of your system, but we can show that also that it is effective in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we're targeting. And just examples, just a quick scan through, and I'll go through some of them in more detail later on. First one is around starting from the ground up, I suppose, grassland management. So starting from the ground, improving your pH, improving your indexes, meaning that any nutrients that you put on that farm, you're going to get a better response in terms of the grass growth. So you're going to get better bang for what you put into the system. Similarly then incorporating clover, and there has been talks around clover in the last while, and Lisa's going to be talking to a degree about that as well in the next talk. Essentially why clover, it's a legume, and what legumes are able to do is essentially to take nitrogen from the atmosphere, they bring it down to the soil, and then they basically distribute it to companions or forages. So basically it has potential to substitute synthetic fertilizers, which are very intensive greenhouse gas-wise, but they're also very costly. Reduce the cost of feed then, animal health. You know, if an animal is hampered in any way in terms of their health, the animal is not going to reach their optimal performance, and it's going to take longer for that animal to finish. The longer that animal is on the farm, the more they're going to eat, the more they're going to release in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Fertiliser type then, there's been talks around protected urea, and I'll go into more detail on that. And then genetic selection as well, improving the genetic merit of your flock to improve the efficiency of your system. Once again, we'll talk about that. So that's just an overview of what's standoutish when you just look at the sheep as a whole. They have been condensed down into what is in the signpost program. So they have been condensed down to the different steps that could be taken, specifically for sheep farms. So looking at management, as I talked about, from the soil up, going from correcting your for pH, improving applying you going with protected urea, improving your grassland management, like incorporating rotational grazing. You talk about genetics or breeding, and then finally the diet. What are you feeding your animals? So just to start then, just talk about one of them then to begin with, is the fertilizer type. And this is actually one of the lowest, I suppose, it's the most available or the lowest hanging fruit that we have available to us at the moment. So how it works essentially is, if you look at the right-hand side there, you have CAN, which is a very common fertilizer, you have urea, and then you have protected urea. So that's the urea plus NBPT. What that is nitrous oxide, N2O. And nitrous oxide it's a different greenhouse gas than methane, and it's very potent in compared to CO2. And it is released when you spread a fertilizer on your ground, essentially. So a proportion of the nitrogen you spread is going to be lost as urea, a proportion is going to be lost as nitrous oxide. And what we can see here is when you spread CAN, on average, you're going to result in greater loss of nitrous oxide than if you went with urea or if you went with protected urea. Substantial difference there between the fertilizer types. Similarly, then we look at ammonia, which is on the right-hand side, the NH3, and we go across urea, protected urea, and CAN. We can see that protected urea and CAN, very similar levels of ammonia, but urea, significantly higher ammonia emissions. And ammonia emissions, it's slightly different to that of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not talked about as much, but it is actually more, in my own opinion, I think it's something that we need to look at, because when you look at the national greenhouse gas emissions, 37% comes from agriculture. So there are other sectors that are contributing to it, that they have their, they are responsible for that their proportions. When it comes to ammonia, 99% comes from agriculture. So it is pretty much focusing on agriculture. So it's something that we need to be very conscious of in the back of our minds. So as you can see here, protected urea on the left, protected urea on the right is performing on both sides. So it's a double whammy. You're reducing nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas, and you're reducing urea, you're reducing ammonia, which is an air pollutant. Nothing's cheap anymore. We're all very well aware of that, and fertilizer in particular is no way cheap. But based on last year, even though it was expensive, when you express per kilo nitrogen, protected urea is slightly cheaper when you express per kilo nitrogen than CAN, the most common fertilizer. So by switching to protected urea, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there's potential to increase your profit. If we look at quantity then, and look, this will be discussed as well by Lisa in the following talk. I'd already talked about the fact that white clover fixates nitrogen, the type of fertilizer, the type of clover, how much it varies. How you manage that clover, the quantity of nitrogen it'll bring in will vary. But essentially, as I said, what this can do and how it helps us is that it can substitute synthetic fertilizer with atmospheric derived nitrogen. So there's no greenhouse gas emissions by doing that, essentially. Lisa will show that you can actually achieve similar forage yields, and this has been shown across a number of studies across Teagasc that you can achieve the same yield while incorporating clover with a reduced use of chemical nitrogen. Clover itself is a higher quality feed than grass only, and that was talked about in the previous talk. And then you also can achieve greater animal performance as well. And this was actually shown. Okay, it is a dairy study and it was done in Moore Park, but it's still very appropriate. So there was 3 treatments. So there was cows grazing on a farm that was spreading 250 kilos of nitrogen, that it was grass only. There was cows grazing on a treatment with 250 kilos of nitrogen with grass and white clover. And then on the right-hand side, you have a system there that was spreading 150 kilos of nitrogen with grass and white clover. And when you look at it on greenhouse gas emissions perspective, you're reducing your emissions per kilo output, which is the top bar. So you're reducing that by approximately 10%. And then when you express it per hectare, which is, in other words, reducing your total emissions, which is what we're trying to achieve, you're able to reduce that by a similar margin also. So it is effective there. The other thing that they found on this, it was the exact same yield, if not slightly higher for the clover 150 in comparison to grass 250, which is considered the standard. And you're also increased your milk solids output as well, so it increased the profitability. So it's economic benefit and also has potential, and also will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Genetics then, so this is work that we've done with Norrie McHugh and Sheep Ireland. So using the CPT commercial data, why isn't that working now? Yeah, so we looked at two types, two flocks essentially. So we had a 1-star flock and we had a 5-star flock, okay? When we look at the performance of those animals, we can see that the key differences are, so we had the same number of animals, we had the same area of ground. The difference was the weaning rate, so we're going from 1.5 to 1.7, and the days to slaughter, so you're going from 203 up down to 190, so 13 days, so 2-week reduction in the average age of slaughter. And you're also getting more lambs out of the ewe. When you do an economic analysis on that, when you put it through a bioeconomic model, what you're finding here is that you're increasing the profit by €18 a head. When you look at greenhouse gas emissions, because the system is more efficient at producing that lamb, there's less greenhouse gas emissions in the system to produce that lamb. And what we found is that the 5-star animals had a 7% lower greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of carcass than that of the 1-star. This is another study that was done, and it's I suppose looking at prolificity that has come up a couple of times, and stocking rate as well. So this was done in Athenry back in 2016 by Elizabeth Earle with Phil Creighton. And you had 3 stocking rates. So you had low at 10 ewes per hectare. I wouldn't consider that low, but for this treatment it's called low. You had medium at 12 ewes a hectare, and then you'd high at 14 ewes a hectare. And then there's 2 types of two prolificity groups. So you had ewes giving you 1.5 lambs per ewe at weaning, and then you had ewes giving you 1.8 lambs at weaning. Similarly, what we looked at economics. Does it make economic sense to do either of those things? And what we found is that on the bottom left hand, if you can read it, I'm not wearing my glasses, it's a bit blurry, but as you increase your stocking rate, as you increase your weaning rate from 1.5 to 1.8, regardless of stocking rate, you're going to increase your profit per hectare. Makes sense, you have more lambs out of your ewes. Similarly then, when you increase your stocking rate, you're going to increase your profit per hectare. Okay, you're going to put more in, there's more inputs in the system, it's more intensive, and that is a concern. You are increasing the profit per hectare all the same. Now, bear in mind, this was done a couple of years ago, before the increase in farm inputs as well. So we have to bear that in mind as well. Greenhouse gas, so the same study, when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions, then when you look at their carbon footprint, so that's emissions per kilo output, which is, as you see, per kilo carcass weight, we can see if you go from 1.5 lambs per ewe to 1.8, across stocking rates, you're going to reduce your carbon footprint. So going from about 24.4 to 25.6, and you're reducing that down to approximately 21 to 22. When you go with the stocking rate, then going from 10, 12, and to 14, you're slightly increasing your carbon footprint. Okay. I suppose first of all, the reason why the carbon footprint went down, depending on the prolificity, is because you're diluting the ewe. So your ewe is giving you more carcass output. So instead of just giving you 1.5 lambs, you're getting 1.8 lambs. So there's more carcass to put against that ewe's emissions. When you look at the stocking rate, there was a slight increase as you increase your stocking rate, and that is because I suppose is the way in which the stocking rate was achieved. This was done through increasing your fertiliser. And as I already said previously, there is emissions associated when you spread fertiliser, particularly if it's in the form of calcium ammonium nitrate or CAN. Then when you look at the total emissions, as you would expect, what happens is if you increase your weaning rate, because you've more animals in the system, there's more lambs coming from your ewes, your emissions as a total will increase, and as you increase your stocking rate, your emissions will increase also. So that's due to more animals in the system essentially. The same area, all you're doing is increasing the animals within the system. It's important to note that, look, that was all achieved through increasing your fertiliser. I think it was 13 kilos per ewe in the system, so 13 times whatever the stock rate is there. In reality, what could be achieved is if you incorporate clover into your sward, you can maintain that stocking rate. So you can maintain that 10 ewes a hectare. You can maintain that 12 ewes per hectare. You can increase your weaning rate, but you're reducing your reliance on fertiliser. So you can maintain your output, you're reducing your reliance, and that could help you in reducing your total farm emissions, while also, economic beneficial because the same output is being achieved. And I think this is the last one then, just in regards to this, is animal health, okay? And look, I already alluded to it in that if you compare a healthy animal that has no ailments on them to an animal that does have some for an ailment, they're not going to reach their potential. They're not informed. They're not eating. They're going to be around for longer than they're going to be around longer in the farm than animals that are healthy. Typical signs: reduced live weight gain, higher mortality rate, reduced reproductive performance, so the ewes won't stand to be tipped. Reduced feed conversion, which basically means that animal will have to eat a lot more to give you that extra kilo carcass weight, and that's because they're also fighting off certain illness. And then for ewes that have, for example, foot rot or are not performing well, you'll have to increase your culling rate. All of those together will increase your greenhouse gas emissions because the animals are around for longer. If you increase your mortality, you have less animals in this. You're not. I suppose you're not efficient in your production system, and you're also reducing your profitability because them animals aren't achieving their optimum performance. So really, what you have to try to achieve here, some of these, as you can see on the right hand side, they are visual. So you can see lame animals. You can see, infected navel will lead to a joint ill. You have a lamb that has a scar on them. That's all visual, but in reality, and Dave would have brought this up, there are ailments that you can't see. So that's why certain things like worms, you need to go out and you need to do fecal egg counts to determine what is your current starting point. Do I need to amend it? Do I need to correct that? Do I need to put in appropriate actions to address it? Similarly, then, if you want to do a vaccination program as well, try to prevent any mortalities later on. Then the case study. So this is just a quick snapshot of what I suppose is a take on an average farm, and if you implement different practices, what impact would that have? Okay, and bear in mind, anything that we don't do here, as I said at the beginning, is a practices that we have shown that has potential to increase your profitability. It doesn't make sense otherwise for you to put that in place. The method is called life cycle assessment. I will not go into this in detail because I'm time conscious, but essentially what happens is you're taking into emissions all the emissions that occur for you to produce that product. So it's not just what happens on your farm, but it also takes into account the emissions that go into producing your farm inputs, whether it's concentrate feed, whether it's fertiliser, whether it's electricity. We need to account for that. And essentially then your key outputs are whether it's live weight, whether it's carcass weight or wool. Okay? So this is a typical, I suppose, or a take on an average lowland system. Stocking rate 7.8 ewes per hectare, using 73 kilos of nitrogen. Typical March lambing with a mortality rate of 7.9%, a weaning rate of just under 1.4, and a replacement rate of 25%. And then when you look at animal performance, drafting at 45, around 46 kilo to get you that 20 kilo carcass. And in terms of drafting, 60% gone on the 1st of October. Concentrate there, you may think it's high, but that is including lambs as well as ewes, so it's just expressed per ewe. So when we do that, we put that into a life cycle assessment model to calculate the carbon footprint of your farm. What we see is the average farm in Ireland, or that take on an average farm in Ireland, is 10.8 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo live weight. So every kilo live weight that's produced on a farm, there's 10.8 kilos of carbon dioxide produced. If you look at the breakdown, 66% is from methane. I already talked about that before. It's just that animal digesting the feed to achieve that live weight, to produce that milk for her lamb. The next then is nitrous oxide. That's 19%. So that's coming from just you spreading your fertiliser. I've mentioned that. It is a key source of greenhouse gas emissions, and it is something that we can focus on. Other sources then, grazing. So when animals are out grazing, they're going to produce manure. Sheep have less emissions from grazing than cattle. That's why it's such a small proportion. And then carbon dioxide. It's relatively small, and that's coming from the concentrate feed as well as the use of fossil fuels. So if that's the average farm, is around 10.8 per kilo live weight gain. There to break down the emissions. What can we do to reduce that, or what's available to us to reduce it? So first of all, looking at mortality rate. Going from 7.9 to 5%, what impact will that have? If we reduce our reliance on concentrate feed, if you implement a good a rotational grazing system, that means that you're ensuring that there's good quality grass in front of that lamb at all times. It's going to achieve that target live weight at an earlier time, which means there's less need for you to come in with concentrate for them to finish for you. Synthetic fertiliser, reducing that by 20%, assuming that you're bringing clover into your farm. And then your weaning rates. Average is 1.4, increasing that to 1.5 it's not significant, and but it still can impact all the same. And then we're looking at, if you put all those in place, what impact would you have? And essentially what happens is, when you go across, we're starting at 10.8, and as you go across, mortality will reduce your emissions per kilo output by approximately 2.5 to 3%. Similarly then, with concentrate, nitrogen, and the nitrogen fertilizers, weaning rate, you get a more of a reduction. And then when you put all those together, you're getting a reduction of 9.6%, down from 10.8 to 9.6. So that's a 10% reduction, 11% reduction approximately in going from base, and when you put all those together. It's important to note the protected urea and the nitrogen fertilizer practices. It'll reduce your emissions per kilo output, but it'll also reduce your total emissions. It's very effective in reducing total emissions. And as I said, it's 25% reduction we need to achieve. They're the key strategies that are available to us. Other ones then, if you reduce your mortality rate, you increase your weaning rate, you are increasing the number of animals in the system, which in turn may increase your total farm emissions. But you are increasing the output of your system as well, so you're increasing the number, the amount of carcass that you're producing. So to produce the same quantity of carcass, you need less ewes to basically achieve that when you improve mortality and you improve weaning rate. So look, overall, I'm just being time conscious now. I flew through that last one, but anyways, the key messages. The Irish sheep system, we're producing a high-value nutritional commodity that's produced off grass, which is very, very important. And we're utilising, and I said it already, we're utilising a natural resource that cannot be used, on area that cannot be used for other purposes. On average, we're looking at 10.8 per kilo of live weight. If you compare that to international, that value is approximately 12. So we are performing there. We're starting from a very good strong point, and this is it's going to be important in terms of the future marketing of our products. We have tools available to us to identify practices that will reduce your emissions, while also taking into account what's the cost associated with putting them in place. So that's the Teagasc MAC, and as I said, that's being updated. At the moment, and will be available in the next couple of months. As a whole, the industry has to be proactive in adopting these mitigation strategies. As I said, these targets, they're not there just to look at. They're actually in law now that we have to start to achieve it. So what we need to do is to move the trend in the right direction. We need to start adopting these, showing that agriculture is being proactive. We are putting practices into place to reduce emissions, and we are collectively trying to achieve the target set by the government. So look, that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. So thank you.